Hello there and welcome back to episode 2 and the road to 700 kilos. So you have an idea on what the hell is happening in the background. You have got my training week. So from everything that I've recorded through the week, not every single lift is included, and there are some lifts that I have had to move around due to just the time variations between my A and B sessions to my C and D sessions. Those heavier loads on the A and B, the comp lifts and the supplemental work, just take a lot more time. Heavier loads, bigger rest periods, while C and D, yes, there's more volume, but generally there is less intensity, and just I got through them a lot quicker as well. I think you've always got to consider that when you're not handling as heavier loads, it takes less warm-ups, it takes less time to be ready. You know, when you're hitting 6 and 8s, you're probably not dying for 5 minutes in between. A couple of minutes, you're probably good to go, because my conditioning's not too down the pan at the moment. So, moving forwards, emerging strategies, this is what I spoke about in my last video. It's reactive training systems approach to powerlifting. And why follow reactive training systems approach? Because they go a bit against the grain with the emerging strategies approach. Well, look what they put on the platform. Their method probably isn't for most people. It's not for average gym goers, it's not for your bodybuilders, it's not for people who just want to get moderately strong. They are specialized in making strong powerlifters, and they do a very good job of it. So whether I continue this forever or whether I just take some bits that I learn from it, I think it's a very good phase to go through. One of the biggest interests to me is finding that time to peak. One thing I've always struggled with a traditional linear plan is normally it's say 3 to 4 weeks, then you deload. Maybe it's 6 weeks and deload, but it's very set just because it's how the numbers work. It's like, well, we add 2.5, we add or take a rep. It looks pretty on paper and it works on maths and it fits what we have found out through studies, but it doesn't fit the individual. And I know, like, when I've gone through blocks, I always think like 3 weeks just never quite feels enough. I always feel like I've got another good week in there. Yet extend something to 6 weeks, and I'm finding towards the end of the 5th week into the 6th, I'm starting to lag. Things starting to get really tough, and I'm starting to lose motivation. So I know that my best point probably isn't 3 weeks, and it probably isn't 6. So emerging strategies, by removing all the noise of training, I am very interested to see where things look their best in terms of performance. I also know, especially on my deadlift, I tend to perform very well on my deadlift when I feel beat up. I don't know what that is, but I reckon emerging strategies might kind of highlight why. Maybe that is the week that I peak. So even though I'm feeling a bit off that week, it's actually a week where I see good performance before my performance actually starts to drop. So time to peak is one of my big reasons why. I think it's very interesting, and it's something that Mike has mentioned. It's pretty consistent. It's down to the exposures to that comp lift. So if that's the case, I think that's something really, really key when programming for powerlifting, and I'm very interested to find out where that is, and after 1 or 2 blocks I should have a pretty good idea where my time to peak is. I also like the fact that it's finding out that although science and studies can show that generally volume will decrease and intensity will go up, and it makes sense, but it's just at what degree and to what point, which is what interests me. I know that like my squat and my deadlift perform pretty well with like lower reps, and I'll talk more about that once we get into it. My bench, I'm not saying it doesn't perform, but I do pick up a lot of niggles when I'm in those like doubles and triples. So more time spent lifting makes more sense. And I'm not saying that my progression is any slower using higher reps. So I think experimenting and finding the reps and the volumes for me within the realms of high and low volume is going to be very interesting. So my approach, how have I approached this? Well, I've had to take everything that I know. I know emerging strategies is all about getting away from having a traditional approach to periodization and more on selecting what your body responds best to. But I've also got to consider what I have done in the past and where my body does seem to respond very well. And therefore, planning this, I've had to look back at my last couple of blocks. So before this, and something that made me want to adopt more of an emerging strategies approach is I was running a very linear progressed powerlifting template. Before that, it was a hypertrophy upper lower. So in that hypertrophy upper lower, big compound lifts, not necessarily comp, but the big, there was still a squat, bench, and deadlift, where they weren't always comp. Bench was incline, sometimes flat. Deadlift was sumos and lots of stiff leg deadlift work in there, with the odd comp deadlift thrown in. So I was a lot more relaxed in that hypertrophy upper lower. That is why I was training it. I needed flexibility within my training at that time. But the big compounds were at sixes. I then came into a powerlifting block because I wanted to regain that more specific strength. And I dropped down to fives, and then I finally dropped down to fours as the load was going up. So I was just getting more and more specific. So my last powerlifting block ended with fours, and I'd seen some very good results. So it does kind of lend that logically we would then go for threes. Also, the fact that threes on my squat and deadlift appear to be where they respond very, very well. If I look back at my squat, in my lead up to my first competition on my intensity blocks, talking old school here, doubles were always where I saw really good peak in performance. And obviously that peak in performance is going to lend itself to what happened the previous week, and also the fact that volume would have reduced. So I think playing with threes is a logical place for me to be. I will potentially then play with doubles and then reverse back up. It's kind of what I'm thinking at the moment, depending on the feedback I get. So squats and deadlifts, my main work on my competition lifts is threes at 85% of my projected 1RM. Bench, on the other hand, I've kept at fours, which is the same as the last block, but also that block was progressing really well, and I've actually opened up my bench grip. I was naturally and am naturally a closer bencher, and this is the first time I've opened up my grip on the bench and it's felt okay. I wouldn't say it feels good. Okay, it doesn't feel bad. I'm not sure how it feels. I don't feel like I'm getting like loads of like, wow, yeah, cool, I'm adding 5 kilos to my bench or anything like that by any means, but I've gone up as far as I can in terms of width on the bench press, which I used to train mid finger, now it's forefinger, so it's slightly wider. So it is a slight variation to what I was doing, but fours work so well. I feel like I'm gaining a good amount of strength in there. And it means I have to lock in. If I go too low on reps with a bench press, I tend to pick up a couple of little niggles, little left shoulder here, just doesn't like it. And then also, I find that I just cheat. I'm just not crisp. I'll be doing triples, and those first two will be good, and that third one I'll be like, oh, but, did the hips lift? Was I tight? Was everything locked in how it should be? It just doesn't feel good. It just feels a bit too grindy to say that my form was on point. So, therefore, bencher I am keeping at fours. And with these, squat, bench and deadlift, I work up to a single and 8, which will put me about 90%, 92% of my 1 rep max. And then I will calculate back to find the 85 or the 80% that I need for my work sets. Supplementary movements. Right, so I know some people would therefore increase the reps through the week, but for me, I've treated my supplementary movements like my heavy technique work that I'm used to performing. Yet again, it's keeping something similar for my first block in order to keep total training volume the same. Because if I was to push these up, then it would have quite a big effect on my training volume. So squats and deadlifts, I'm actually performing 1 rep less than my comp, and my bench, yet again, 1 rep less. So squat and deadlift I'm doing for doubles, bench is triples. Load is going to be less than my comp due to the variation, pauses for the bench and the deadlift, and my newfound love for pin squats on the squat. So we've got to think exercise selection. I've always done pause work. It's easy, it's simple, and the racks where I was training, I couldn't get the pin at the right height without balancing loads of blocks, etc. But here, pins are at a good height. So with the pin squat, which is not what you're seeing here, it's a high bar squat. With the pin squat, which will actually come up in a little bit, it might actually be the next movement after this. With the pin squat, I feel it keeps me in just that perfect position. It makes me sit back because I do tend to just drift forwards a little bit. It makes me sit back and it fires up my quads. I'm very posterior dominant, probably why I got a big deadlift, but my quads aren't always there. Hence why I do have the pin squat, and I find it keeps me up. It keeps me, like I say, in that bit of a textbook position. Here we go. We now have the pin squat here, which, yeah, I trialed it before running this block through the pivot, and I just liked it. It just felt on the money. I feel like there's a lot to be taken from this movement. Training may tell me I'm completely wrong and I'm better doing pause squats. Pause on the bench, I personally like. If you can pause for 3 count, you know that in comp you're confident. And I think when you look at comp, especially around the level that I'm competing at, you can tell the people who pause. There's a lot of people who they train bench, touch and go all the time, and obviously there's a comp, which I think is a pause, and then obviously if you've got the 3 counts, if you've got a very harsh pause, then you're not going to be too put off guard, and it keeps me tight. Deadlift, same again. The pause is very simple. I've tried deficits in the past and got nowhere with them. I may bring them back, but I just find that just pausing in that one bit which I feel the weakest, which for me is like just off the floor, like just break the floor, because I know as soon as I'm off the floor, I've never had an issue locking out. So I pause as low to the floor as possible, and I've just found they've had really good carryovers. With the supplementary work, I know some people all train it lighter, and I will try training those movements at a slightly lower percentage with more reps in future blocks. But for now, I'm actually keeping it pretty heavy, keeping up there in the 8s or 9s, because I personally don't think your form's not going to fail at 70, 80%. It's only when you're getting into those higher percentages where you're going to see your form really break down. Well, that's my mindset and thought process at the moment. Everything else that's happening around is there to support the main lift. So sometimes you could sit there and think, you're not doing a lot of squatting, because of my comp squats only 3s. But you've got to remember, within there, I've got pin squats, I've got front squat, I've got high bar squats, and I've got safety squat bar squats. Bench, there's loads of variations, and most bench sessions will then have like a close grip or an overhead. I'm going to put up a bit of an overview just towards the end of this once I've finished talking, so you can get a little bit of an idea on where we are. Session D, that's how 120 moves, and you can see that pause quite low off the floor. So moving forwards, it's all about just repeating what I'm doing, not changing volume, not changing reps, not changing sets, and just adjusting load in accordance to RPE. So if I can get 2.5 kilos on the bar each week, awesome. If I can't, I will just repeat. Maybe RPEs will feel a little bit lower. And that way I can see what is working, what isn't. I can tell you from talking from the future. I've only done one session in week 2 at the moment, but things are good. Like, I've seen progression, so I know I've probably got a good amount of dosage that's yielding that progression from taking what I've got. And hey, it's not perfect. I look forward to exploring different rep ranges, different lift variations, and finding what works for me. And I think that's what emerging strategies is all about. It's not having the best; it's just having better than what you have had, and just knowing the movements where, right, I probably ought to do a little bit more of this, and I ought to probably do a little bit more less of that. One thing I've actually brought in is some dumbbell pressing. I haven't dumbbell pressed in ages, but these feel really good. Hope they have some carryover. If not, they are just very well satisfying my inner bodybuilder. So there we have it. I am going to remove my face and put up the overview of my training plan just for those people that want to geek out on it. If you've got any questions, please ask. Like I say, it's not perfect. It's all about learning. It's all about responding to what we see. Hit like, hit subscribe, drop your comments below, and I will catch up with you next week.